So I'm Ingrid Karyotis. I'm here to introduce the next speaker. I teach English at Sierra College. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Chris Hall. Chris Hall is a creative writer trapped in the body of an English professor and an academic. He was born in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana and transplanted to the Yuba Sierra bioregion. Along with foxes and raccoons and innumerable other non-human kin, he lives with his partner, their 3-year-old daughter, infant son, and several cats in a house on the fringes of a deep, dark wood. Chris spent his formative years as a nerdy kid, playing too much Dungeons and Dragons, reading too much Tolkien. He finds himself drawn toward the mythic, the adventurous, and the wild in his writing. One of his abiding preoccupations involves the use of speculative fiction and fantasy as a means to explore deep ecological themes. Much of his recent work centers around giving voice to the voiceless and allying with those often silenced. Chris is passionate about writing for eco-justice and would argue that writers can and should play a vital role in bringing attention to systemic marginalization, oppression, and murder of both our human and non-human kin for the profit of a few. None of this diminishes the primary reason Chris continues to be drawn toward environmental writing, his deep and abiding love for the natural world. His writing has appeared in places such as the Pacific Crest Trailside Reader, Resilience, a journal of the environmental humanities, and is forthcoming in We Who Are About to Die, Swords and Sorcery Anthology. Chris teaches at Sierra College, where he also co-advises the Mythopoetics Club and oversees selection of literary pieces for the Sierra Journal. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Ingrid. And I just want to start with a moment of gratitude because I feel I have so many hard acts to follow today. I'm really grateful to be here, and I really feel that I just want to be upfront about the fact that I'm a little bit nervous and feel a little bit, like I'm in the company of giants right now. And I think that's probably a good thing. I'm thinking back to all the presentations from yesterday and all the wonderful stuff we've had, and I'm just honored to be part of this. I'm going to share my screen in a moment here, but before I do that, and this might seem a little corny and a little airy-fairy, but like Ingrid was saying, I mean, we've had a lot of heavy content, and we've had a long pandemic and a long quarantine. So I think it's important to take those moments for yourself. And I want to start my presentation which is on the personal and the planetary, right? Finding the planetary and the personal and the other way around. I'd like you guys to just get up from your chairs. I'm going to do it too, so you won't have anyone talking to you if you stick around. Get up from your chairs. Go outside if you can. If you're watching a kiddo like I was earlier, or some reason you don't want to go outside right now, that's okay. Look out a window. And what I want you to do is just a quick opening exercise. Just look out at the sky, because even if you live in a very urbanized place where things have been covered, where the plants and animals are scarce, non-human animals are scarce, you still have the sky. Trees still break up through the cracks in the pavement. So I want you to just take a moment to appreciate the natural world around you and take a moment to do this sort of opening thought experiment with me. Try to just fathom how small you are in comparison to everything that's around you. I mean, if you could get a glimpse of the sun safely, think about the fact that it's 93 million miles away. And think about what that means. I mean, it's a huge world we live in, and we're all very small. And I want to start with that as sort of a grounding moment. So get up, get out of your chairs, go outside for about a minute, and I'll be back in that minute. I saw somebody say or type in the chat. I appreciate that. I hope that moment gives you that sense of a little bit of groundedness and maybe a little bit of relief of some of the anxiety that builds. For me, certainly when I spend a whole day inside, I get very anxious. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about today is sort of where we're at with this COVID-19 pandemic and how it might offer us some opportunities to find in our own personal moments of anxiety and fatigue and everything else that attends this sort of these moments, how we might make broader connections between our individual lived experience and the larger experience of the world and what's going on the planet right now with humans and more than humans. I want to kind of follow. Oh wait, Captain Planet, how did he get in here? Somebody gave me the nickname Captain Planet yesterday. I want to address that actually. I think it's a great nickname. I'd love to be Captain Planet of Sierra College, but actually this is not just a joke. It's going to go somewhere, so bear with me. I think it's important to act in allyship or maybe show up as co-conspirators with or for people as I see them, who literally can't speak, animals and plants. And I think it's important to represent those who literally do not have voices humans can hear any way we can, as faithfully and powerfully and articulately as we are able. But I don't think that means we are saviors. I certainly don't consider myself a savior. I don't have my own answers, so I don't have yours. What I do have is a process I go through that helps me out when I'm struggling to find inspiration to write, when I'm overwhelmed by the news of the world, and that's what I'm here to share with you today. So before I jump into that any further, I just wanted to kind of dismantle that savior mentality and make sure everyone understands I'm certainly not I don't see myself as a savior. That colonized ego that needs to be the one leading the show is not what I'm trying to do. It's not who I'm trying to be. I think that we have a lot of conversations rightly about injustice. And I think we need to just make sure we extend that conversation to include intersectional eco-justice that sees links between the plight of people who are treated as less than human. Let's face it, if we think back to Dr. Love's presentation this morning, but we need to see links between people who are treated as less than human by the dominant culture and those who are literally not human beings by our modern scientific definitions, plants and animals who do have personhood in indigenous and other traditional ways of knowing. So I'm going to read the land acknowledgement. I don't think anyone did read it today. If they did, I was chasing my 3-year-old around the room. So forgive me if I hope this isn't land acknowledgement fatigue, but I'm going to read it word for word because I have it here. And then I want to talk about it briefly as a segue into my presentation. So with respect, we acknowledge the Rockland campus of Sierra College as the traditional and unceded land of the Nisenan and Miwok peoples. The secret ravine, known in Nisenan as Hoyok, is home to an ancestral village site protected for generations by local tribal nations and their members. Sierra College commits to an ongoing relationship with the United Auburn Indian community and other local tribes, and to respect the legacy of the first peoples of this land and their future generations who are an integral part of the Sierra College community. I think it's so good that land acknowledgements are becoming widespread. They're becoming the norm in institutions, include academia, but also outside of academia, because we're on legally unceded territory. We're on legally stolen land. And I mean, you can talk about cultural definitions of right to be here, but you can't really talk about legal right. I mean, we're not legally supposed to be here. The United States stole land across the board. And I think that's a good place to start. It's also I have a quick example from my life growing up in mining and placer mining country in Nevada County, California, to share with you about how my own personal experience as a child connects to larger planetary issues. So when I was a kid, that we always, like in every grade practically, in elementary and grade school, we would go on these field trips that were supposed to be these really fun field trips where we would go see, sorry, I'm saying I'm a little nervous, but where we would go see the Pelton wheels and the hydraulic cannons that were used to blast landscape green growing things to bare red earth for the extraction of gold. And from the first field trip that I went on, there was always something wrong to me about those moments where we would watch we would go see these artifacts used in mining. I never enjoyed them, and I never could really say why. And I asked my parents about it, and they knew enough history, enough about the North American genocide of Native American people, and the extirpation of buffalo and fen salmon, and many other species, passenger pigeons, to name a few ready examples. They knew enough about that to give me some insight onto maybe why I was feeling a little weird about these trips, that this was aggrandizing a part of our, or valorizing a part of our history that really doesn't deserve to be valorized. And so when I learned about that as a boy, I became interested in learning more about the Anishinaabe people. And as a kid, there was not much information around for me growing up in the 80s. That became much more available. Information became much more available as I matured. And now the Nevada City Rancheria is attempting to gain federal recognition for the Anishinaabe tribe. And I'm not an expert on this, but other tribes in our area are trying to get federal recognition, which they lost back in, I think it was the 60s, because it wasn't convenient to have federally recognized tribes for all the reasons that it's inconvenient for the US government to have those things. So my point here is my own individual experience feeling overwhelmed by these feelings of grief over this loss. Like, I mean, the landscape is blasted up in Nevada County. You go, the trees we have here are, I think they're third growth forests. They're definitely not old growth. They're destroyed. All the trees were destroyed for the mining and the settler, and by settler colonialism. And so like trips to mining sites were really horrific for me as a child, seeing this red earth blasted by hydraulic cannons where green growing things used to thrive. So that's to me a place where you can see that connection between the human and the more than human, and between the personal experience and the larger experience. So that's my personal take on the land acknowledgement. I'm attempting here to make this a little bit more personal and make it come alive so that me as a non-native person, I can say what this means to me. Dr. Leal, our tribal liaison, told us in a workshop I went to about the land acknowledgement that it's important for non-native folks to show up and say what it means to them. And so that's what it means to me. And I recognize that I'm the son, or the descendant of colonizers. But I think it's time that we all wake up. And this is part of my waking up, was this little journey. Okay. So there are a few phrases I'm going to use and a piece I'm going to read to you here quickly, just a little piece about what we're here to do today in the workshop that you probably need to know in order to really understand what I'm saying. A friend of mine went over an article I was writing for this to promote the conference, and she said, you know, I think you need to define some of the terms. So I'm defining some terms that I'll use, some of them in the piece I'm about to read, the brief piece I'm about to read, and then in just discussing topics related to making the personal planetary and the other way around. So more than human is a phrase I'll use. I like it better than nature or non-human, or natural world, because nature renders a world of living beings into an abstraction, and non-human excludes humans from nature, and we're actually part of nature. So I'll say more than human instead of non-human or nature. The phrase more than human kin is a phrase that refers to the recognition common among the world's indigenous peoples that humans have a larger familial, meaning family, relationship to the larger community of life. There's a great book by David Abrams, The Spell of the Sensuous, Perception and Language in a More Than Human World, it's really a pretty hard read. I'm into English. I'm interested in linguistics, but he brings background as a linguistic and as an anthropologist, as a linguist and as an anthropologist, to talk about the act of perception, the way language plays a role in how we perceive and how we understand the world. It's an incredible book. It's very difficult, but incredible book. I'd recommend to anyone who wants a challenging but fascinating read. Anthropocentrism is another word that I think is important to just think about. When we think about Captain Planet, actually, that's an anthropocentric view. It's a view that humans are at the center or at the top of a hierarchy of an implied or imagined hierarchy over the rest of life, that humans are up at the top and everything else is underneath us somehow. And we see this view supported in sort of classical Enlightenment era scientific thinking. And we also see it reflected in the world, monotheistic religions as they played out predominantly throughout the world's history. So we see it both by religion and science. We see justified this view of humans at the top and everything beneath us, that human-centered, anthropocentric view. And you can just say human-centered, but if you want a fancy word to confuse your opponents in an argument, you can say you're being anthropocentric. That's what I like, big words. Ecocentrism is the counterpunch to anthropocentrism. It maintains that the Earth's living systems should constitute the central point of orientation. So I see myself as the sum of all sustaining relationships. That's a phrase, it's a nice phrase, but it's not mine. I stole it from my mentor, California poet and fiction writer, Jim Dodge. The self is the sum of all sustaining relationships. So when I show up, it's not Captain Planet, it's, except for in the sense that it's everything. It's all my relationships showing up. It's my human and more than human relationships that sustain me, that keep me alive, that gets me here. That community, that larger community, bigger than ourselves. That's ecocentrism. Another couple phrases I didn't put words up on the slide for because I don't want to overwhelm people with a bunch of slides, but the Anthropocene is a common term, not universally agreed upon by scientists, but used by some scientists to describe the current geological time that we're living in. We're not living in a time defined by the movement of great geological systems. We're in a time defined by human impact on the planet. So some call this period the Anthropocene, the time of the humans, the time when we have made the biggest impact on the planet, and we're the force shaping planetary systems, that humans are shaping actually planetary systems, and the future of the planet will be marked most noticeably by our presence. And unfortunately, mostly not in a good way. From the science I've read and from the stories I've read of indigenous peoples and others who are living on the ground where the environmental problems are really hitting the hardest. Because let's face it, it's the most marginalized human communities who bear the brunt of this resource extraction, settler colonialist culture we still maintain. So anyway, the Anthropocene, it's the time we're living in. And I don't know that, like I said, I don't hold the magical answer like, hey, I'm going to save you all. Like, we're in dire times and here's the answer. But I do think, from what I've read and what I've learned in a lifetime of being concerned about some of these things, that the ecological view, the ecological self in relationship to other beings, where the human species is treated as one, where that sort of oneness is acknowledged, where men, like in the ego, the male figure is put above what looks like a female figure, where that kind of gender hierarchy doesn't exist, where racial hierarchy doesn't exist in the same way, where class hierarchy doesn't exist in the same way that it does in the dominant culture, but instead the self is in relationship to all that is, simply one among many. And I think there's wisdom in that, and I think there's power in that, and I think it applies to what I'm touching on today with making the personal planetary, and that I think that the more we can strive to abandon a narrowly anthropocentric or egocentric, which is even worse, viewpoint, and embrace a more ecological or ecocentric viewpoint, the better off we'll be. And the more we'll be able to make those connections in our writing between our own experience and a broader experience that's bigger than us. Okay, but I want to bring you guys in to this a little bit. I'm going to read a piece in just a minute here, but I want to bring you guys into this a little bit. I've talked a lot already. I feel like it's monologic. This Zoom system, one thing I don't like about it is how much of a monologue it feels. So thanks for everybody saying exactly yes and giving me cheering me on in the chat and bringing up important points. But I want to ask you guys a couple of questions. So the first one is, over the course of the pandemic, how many of you have experienced moments of heightened anxiety? I'd really like to see this. I can't see all of your images because I have a screen share on, but you can, in the chat or with a thumbs up, I'll try to scroll through. Give me a thumbs up if you felt heightened feelings of anxiety. Okay. Lots of thumbs up. Okay. So I'm tricking you here. Trying to make this a positive thing. I'm making you give a thumbs up to anxiety, to your own anxiety. So you can embrace it, because that's part of this. Part of what I'm trying to show you here is embracing that. Okay. So, and I see comments about writing. Don't worry, there's writing time ahead. This is leading into writing. I'm setting something up. So please, I ask your patience. Okay, thank you. And then, do you feel overwhelmed when you think about environmental issues? And somebody said more because of the politics than the virus, they feel some anxiety, and I can certainly understand that. Okay, so let me read my piece to you and see if it speaks to you about how, as a writer, for those who are eager to get to writing, you might be able to look to these feelings as ways to improve your writing, a source of inspiration, a well to plumb the depths of and pull a flash of inspiration from within, perhaps. Okay. And I'm seeing people say some interesting things in the chat. I want to take the time to acknowledge, but I want to stay on point here, so I'm going to read this, and then I'll acknowledge them. As writers, we face a paradox. We must balance between withdrawal and connection. Every writer I know agrees that we must shut out the distractions of the world in order to practice and perfect our craft. But at the same time, for our work to hold real meaning, it must connect to the world. For those of us who write about eco-justice, about the exploitation and murder of our human and more than human kin, for the pleasure and profit of a privileged few, the paradox or paradoxes I'm describing here take on even greater significance. The significance is greater because when we write about the Earth and its inhabitants on the level of the planetary, we can do so only through the lens of our own individual experience. Therefore, we are called to find the connections between the individual and collective. In doing so, we encounter more related paradoxes, more meaningful contradictions, between interiority and exteriority, between the personal and the planetary, between our own despair about the plight of the planet under patriarchy, white supremacy, and late-stage capitalism on one hand, and our own hope for justice and transformation on the other. In this time of social distancing, of global social and environmental crises, many of us are feeling isolated and overwhelmed. This historical moment only makes the power of writing to connect to and transform the world all the more vital. To be clear, when I talk about this moment in history, I'm talking about more than the pandemic. I'm talking about a time when the dominant culture continues to exploit biodiverse ecosystems and indigenous peoples in the names of resource extraction. I'm talking about the Anthropocene, about the slow burn of climate change, the imminent death of the oceans, mass deforestation, and the loss of species unparalleled in the fossil record since the extinction of the dinosaurs some 65 million years ago. And though it pains me to say it, I'm talking about the relentless continuation of business as usual, despite incontrovertible evidence that business as usual is literally murdering entire ecosystems. Yet while stolid scientists and our own experience tell us the world is literally on fire, we are asked daily to put aside our commitments to our kindred, human and non-human, and ourselves in order to conform to some bizarre, economically rationalized standard of behavior that has in fact proven wasteful, inefficient, and destructive to our bodies, minds, and our hearts, from the microcosm to the macrocosm. Will contradictions never cease, we might wonder. I have asked nearly everyone I know how they feel about discussing and engaging with some of the biggest issues of our time, global inequity and ecocide. The answer is almost universally the same. They feel powerless and overwhelmed. They tend to give way to despair. Sober assessments of the situation send them reaching for the bottle. For many, the pandemic has only heightened these overwhelming feelings of paralysis. But though causes for despair do persist, racism, sexism, classism, and if you forgive the awkward word, speciesism, so too do causes for great hope endure. Like many others, I see this pandemic as an opportunity to embrace the lessons and transformations that inhere in paradoxes, lessons both important and overdue. The pandemic offers us an opportunity in the form of a crisis. It reminds us that we need to sit still a bit more often. It quiets the roar of engines so that we may hear the planet screaming at us to slow down, to pay attention, to notice connections we might otherwise miss, like links between deforestation, overpopulation, and the spread of viruses among humans. Are you sick of being stuck at home while you wait for the vaccine? Well, now is the perfect time to embrace the connective power of writing as a social act performed in solitude. Are you sick of witnessing injustice and inequity? Well, now is the perfect time for writers to accept the ethical obligation to transform the world, to wield the power of the pen against the sword held to the throat of our beloved Mother Earth. Now is the moment to see the links between the personal and the planetary. Okay, and I see some things, people in here. So one thing I wanted to, thanks for the compliments and the support, those who are saying nice things like that. I do appreciate it. It's weird talking to yourself on Zoom in front of 60 more people last time I checked. But somebody said the quiet made me hear nature more from the pandemic. And I think that that is so important. And I think that partly, and I don't want to get too Marxist sounding here, but partly the economic system is set up in such a way that most of us, even those with a great deal of privilege like myself, and I own my privilege and I try to be aware of it every day and I try to use it in any way I can for something better than just extracting things and enjoying my own selfish pleasures. But I would say that the economic system leaves us very precious little time to appreciate anything, to slow down and remember that there's a whole world out there that's not human and that humans matter. I'm not saying they don't, we don't, but that there's more to this picture than us. And that if we have that really self-centered and species-centered view, we proceed on the course we've set for ourselves at our own peril. So much peril, in fact, that we will see our record in the fossil record will be like the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, which they think happened probably from an asteroid. So when I show that asteroid there, I'm thinking of that's the legacy we right now stand to leave our children and our children's children and the rest of the planet. So what do we do about it, right? That's what everyone always wants to know. And I think there's a healthy degree of wanting to be proactive and able to act, and that's one thing I want to talk about today. But there's also a level of where optimism is sort of the expected norm, and I think that that can be problematic. And I want to talk about that a little bit today. I don't think we always have to be optimistic. I think we can be realistic and still have realistic cause for hope. So I want to step back for a minute from the litany of loss, as I call it, and not throw at you facts and statistics like the thing about the dinosaurs, the fact that we lose around 200 species a day, last I've read, the fact that insect populations are collapsing. There's lots of that litany of loss. I want to instead tell you a story. And this is the story of Finn McCool and the Salmon of Knowledge. And this is from the Irish Celtic tradition. And there's a quote there that I want to talk about. The salmon flashes to the surface of the dark pool. If it does, something drove it to the surface. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So there was a hero in ancient Irish lore. And in early medieval texts, you'll read about Finn McCool and the Salmon of Knowledge. And Finn was a young boy. When he was born to the leader of this group of heroic fighters, sometimes compared to King Arthur's court. Now, legend and myth have piled up on what might have been history, but the figure of Finn McCool is certainly an interesting story. And he was a young child born to the leader of this group of warriors called the Fianna, who fought sometimes for the High King of Ireland, sometimes for their own cause, for good, for justice, against those who might threaten their way of life and against those who might imperil the communities that they served. When Finn was just a baby, his father was murdered by a rival. And his mother, fearing for the child's life, sent Finn to live with a druid, a teacher named Finnegas. And Finnegas taught Finn the arts of druidry, and he taught him the arts of poetry. And two of the arts of poetry that Finn learned were the art of extemporaneous recitation, which is speaking poetry spontaneously. And the other art that he learned was the metrical sort of roots of poetry, the rhyme and meter, those technical aspects. But he had one other aspect he had not yet learned. And Finnegas said, Finn, today you need to do me a favor. I've taught you well. I've taught you how to fend for yourself in the wild. I've taught you how to hunt and how to fish and how to cook your food. I believe the salmon of knowledge, which is this legendary salmon that if you eat of its flesh, you'll have all knowledge, you'll become omniscient. And the druid said, I finally found out where it is, where the river is. I want you to fish it for me. And I want you to cook it for me. But you must not taste even the smallest taste of that fish, because I have earned it. I have lived my whole life searching for the fish, studying its habits. It's mine, not yours. Finn agreed, being a good pupil, and he went to fish for the fish. He caught the fish. He saw in the dark surface of the water something moving beneath the water, something silvery moving and shimmering in the light. And he reached his hand in and pulled out the salmon, and he held it up. And he knew that in that moment he'd held the salmon of knowledge. And he began to cook it for his mentor. He skewered it and he began to roast it over a spit, over a fire. And he was just about completed with his task was just about completed when suddenly the salmon hissed and spat, and fat from the cooking fish covered Finn's thumb. And in that moment of pain, he stuck his thumb in his mouth. And when he tasted of that fish, all the knowledge of the world was his. And whenever there's a legend that says after that moment, whenever Finn needed to know something, if he stuck his thumb in his mouth, he would have imbus forosnai, which is translates as the inspiration that illuminates. It's that third piece of the poetry puzzle he was missing. And it's also that ability to have knowledge and forethought and foresight. So I see the salmon of knowledge and Finn reaching into this dark pool as a good metaphor for what we do when we confront our own grief, when we confront our own feelings of anxiety and our personal lived experience, and we make a broader connection where we consume of that salmon of knowledge and learn that our own experience connects to a much broader picture. So my goals for us all today, for you all today, with writing are twofold. I want you to gain the courage to accept your own grief and fear when you think about big issues, things that are hard and scary to work with. And I want you to be empowered to write and act in loving relationship with the planet. And I think that I feel like this sounds really grand or grandiose. And I think in my aims, I want it to sound that way. But as far as what we can actually do, I think humility is really important too. And so while I think these are noble goals, I think that we need to be kind to ourselves and accept that baby steps are sometimes what we can do. That if we can confronting that fear doesn't just happen like that. That empowering ourselves to act doesn't just happen overnight. So try to see what people are saying in the chat. And maybe I shouldn't do that, but I'm going to read it. I'm intrigued. Okay, good. Thanks from Bonnie McKeegan there. And yes, Michelle, metaphors be with us. May the metaphors be with us. Okay, I want to read a couple brief quotations for you about this topic of what I call plumbing the depths, which is that reaching into that pool, reaching into your own personal experience, your grief, your pain, whatever it might be, your anxiety, and using it as a tool for writing, for action. Okay. Many activists who rouse us to the fact that our survival is at stake decry public apathy. They often assume mistakenly that people do not change because they lack information, and that the main job of activists is to provide the missing information. The experience of despair work suggests that such numbness and apathy does not stem from ignorance or indifference. On the contrary, most of us are aware of the destruction of the planet at the deepest level, but we do not face it, do not integrate it, for fear of experiencing the despair that such information provokes. We fear it may overwhelm us. Moreover, our society has constructed taboos against the communication and expression of such anguish. The refusal of feeling takes a heavy toll on us, impoverishing both our emotional and our sensory lives. It also impedes our capacity to process and respond to information as we screen out or filter anxiety-provoking data. But such feedback is precisely what we need to adapt and survive. This despair, grief, and anger can be confronted, experienced, and creatively channeled. Far from being crushed by it, new energy, creativity, and empowerment can be released. Unblocking these feelings also opens us to experience our fundamental interconnectedness with all life. Often, after such experiences, people come together to form ongoing support groups or join existing groups to take action on peace and/or environmental issues. So this is from Joanna Macy, who is one of the sort of early proponents of the philosophical school known as deep ecology, which started with Arne Naess, who is a philosopher whose work was taken up actually by Sierra College emeritus and now no longer with us, George Sessions. And deep ecology is a kind of an early form of Western philosophical environmentalism that sees the importance of connecting the dots between the problems of anthropocentrism and planetary destruction, and it's heavily critical of that narrowly anthropocentric view. What Joanna Macy saw was people who understood these kinds of problems and were trying to act on behalf of the planet and for peace work, as it was called. Social justice is really a lot of what she's talking about in her work, actually. People who were doing this work and really doing it well were burning out, were overwhelmed. And so she developed a series of workshops called the Council of All Beings, which I won't go into in great depth, but that's what she's talking about when she's talking about despair work, or these sort of ritualized, almost new ceremonies for the Anthropocene to guide people through the feelings of existential angst and overwhelm that sometimes do come upon us when we're trying to think about these really big, scary topics. So I call this plumbing the depths, this first exercise we're going to do. I have one more quotation I'm going to read you, and then we're going to get to some writing. Okay. And this is from Rebecca Solnit from her book, A Paradise Built in Hell. When I ask people about the disasters they have lived through, I find on many faces that retrospective basking as they recount tales of Canadian ice storms, Midwestern snow days, New York City blackouts, oppressive heat in southern India, fire in New Mexico, the great earthquake in Mexico City, earlier hurricanes in Louisiana, the economic collapse in Argentina, earthquakes in California and Mexico, and a strange pleasure overall. It was the joy on their faces that surprised me. And with those whom I read rather than spoke, too, it was the joy in their words that surprised me. It should not be so, is not so, in the familiar version of what disaster brings. And yet it is there, arising from rubble, from ice, from fire, from storms and floods. The joy matters as a measure of otherwise neglected desires, desires for public life and civil society, for inclusion, purpose, and power. Disasters are most basically terrible, tragic, grievous, and no matter what positive side effects and possibilities they produce, they are not to be desired. But by the same measure, those side effects should not be ignored because they arise amid devastation. The desires and possibilities awakened are so powerful they shine even from wreckage, carnage, and ashes. What happens here is relevant elsewhere. And the point is not to welcome disasters. They do not create these gifts, but they are one avenue through which the gifts arrive. Disasters provide an extraordinary window into social desire and possibility, and what manifests there matters elsewhere, in ordinary times and in other extraordinary times. And that's from Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell, and it's the subtitle is something like The Amazing Communities That Arise in Disasters. And her basic thesis is predicated on the notion of mutual aid, which is that in times of crisis, communities who actually live on the ground and know each other and experience things as communities actually come together. By and large, that altruism seems to be the unifying principle of human nature, if I can use such a term in a postmodern world, rather than competition or enmity or any of those terrible things. And that those things are actually byproducts of a strictly hierarchical, rigid system imposed on us from outside. So, despair work, crisis. I want you guys to be able to do something with these things. So, let's take some writing time to practice plumbing the depths. And I want you to take about 7 minutes on this. I'm going to turn on a timer here. I have to reach for it after I introduce this activity. A timer for about 7 minutes where you can choose a story you've heard. It can be a personal story. It can be a story you've heard, an experience, a fact, whatever, that has caused you distress. Take 7 minutes to explore your feelings about this in writing. And again, this does not have to pertain directly to the environment, though it certainly can. I mean, the workshop is named, making the personal planetary and the other way around. But not every topic here has to touch directly on environmental issues. In my view, everything's environmental if you look hard enough, and there are all those connections you can make. But I want you to just take 7 minutes to think about something that's overwhelming or a cause of anxiety to you. It can be a news item you've heard, like Jen had you do in her workshop, where there's a news headline that maybe troubles you or makes you angry or anxious. It can be an experience, a memory, like my example of the Pelton wheel and the hydraulic mining cannons. Think of it for something and then write. So I really hope you all brought pieces of paper. If you need to get up and grab a piece of paper, I won't know. So go do it. And take 7 minutes. I'm going to get my timer going here. Just got to grab my phone. Fell off my lap. And I'll give you 7 minutes and enjoy it. about a minute left, everybody, just to give you some warning. Okay, so I know these moments I'm asking you to think about your feelings and write about them, and so I'm not going to ask that anybody share out into the chat this part. If you want to, in the next, there's another writing part coming up and after a little bit more material, but I want you to just take a moment and kind of maybe look back over what you wrote, think back over what you just reflected on, and pay attention to the feelings in your body. Because that's another thing that I think COVID has helped us do in slowing down. I've been able to be more aware sort of like how I'm sitting. I'm not driving as much. I'm not in as much of a rush. So I'm able to be more conscious of what my body's doing. And I think when we confront difficult ideas, there's a physical dimension to that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and kind of take that with you as you move on. Acknowledge that that's real rather than trying to shut that out or deny it. Because part of what I'm trying to get us to do today is face feelings that we might otherwise avoid or turn away from in order for this to be generative for you as writers. Because it can really be generative. This is your dark pool that you're going to reach in and grab that salmon of knowledge. So I'll give you my personal example. And I'm always a little hesitant to be overly personal with people. I think it can become about the writer too much when you're writing about the planet. I should clarify, when you're writing about the issues, it can become about your own story too much if you're not careful. But I have a story about my father who passed away in 2015. Chucky, as we called him, Charles Hall, Chucky to me, always growing up, Chucky. I miss you, Chucky. I'm going to take a minute to talk about his loss and a connection I made between my personal feelings of overwhelm about that very personal experience that wasn't directly related to the environment and sort of a larger picture. So my father had died from liver cancer, and I watched him decline sort of without realizing that's what was happening, because he was such a gentle man, but very strong. And I always, as a kid, didn't understand that gentleness is the greatest form of strength until it was almost too late, but it wasn't. We got to have some great last years where I understood him more, and he understood me more than we did our whole lives when I was growing up. So when he was sick, I had feelings of overwhelm that you do. If anyone's ever lost a relative to an illness or to any other kind of decline, it's not fun to watch somebody decline. It's hard. It's painful. It's the thing you dreaded since you were a little kid finally happening. It's shitty. That's the academic word for it. But I realized in these moments with my dad that I wouldn't trade those moments sitting with him, pale and sick and dying, for anything. And that I would show up and be in relationship with my dad as his son, no matter what state he was in, because I love him. Because I loved him. So what does this have to do? How do I make that planetary, or how did that become planetary for me, is a better way to put it, because it's not like I made it, like I went out and said, oh, I'm going to make this planetary. It became planetary for me when I heard, it was a case of hearing somebody say something you've been trying to say your whole life perfectly, in a way that it correlated so perfectly with my own experience, it knocked the wind out of me. When I heard Ayana Young a podcaster whose podcast For the Wild is not to be missed. I don't get any money, any kickbacks for this. I'm promoting it because it's an incredible podcast, what she's doing. She deals with intersectional eco-justice, brings on people talking about all kinds of issues, many of them directly environmental, but not all of them. But she said that people ask her, as someone who's doing this work, and by this work, I mean direct activism, spreading education every single day with every single ounce of energy, and she has a lot of it that she can bring to the table. How does she keep going when the plight of the planet looks so grim, and when things do look really bad, and when somebody said good luck about something earlier, and I mean, I know we need good luck, totally. This is rough. The situation we're in is not one that has an easy solution. That's why I'm not trying to play Captain Planet here for you all. But I will say that no matter what, whether I'm going to win or lose the fight to save the planet, I'm going to show up because it comes from love. My desire to fight that fight comes from love. And to be in love is to show up against all odds at any moment, and to keep fighting, and to keep relating, and to keep nurturing, and to keep giving attention to that which we love, no matter what. It's not about producing something. It's not about being the one to write the book that saves the planet. It's not about being the one who is the voice for your non-human kindred. It's about loving enough to show up and try to be in relation with all the beings on the planet that comprise your only home. So that's an example I wanted to give you of my own personal story and how I've made it planetary for myself. And I want you now to work on this part, which can be more uplifting. I mean, it's still, I think, real work. It's not going to be sugar-coated. It's not like I'm going to give you a magical salmon. I wish I could give you a magical salmon and say, here, eat this, or burn your thumb on it and then stick your thumb in your mouth. Anytime you get in trouble, just do that and you'll be cool. It's not that. It's not a cure. It's not a panacea. But this method has worked for me to produce some writing that I'm proud of. So I ask you now to take 7 more minutes, and we'll be almost out of time. Then we'll have time for just a brief Q&A, I think, to explore the flashes of inspiration you have found in confronting your grief, anxiety, etc. It can be about the story or moment that you wrote about in the first writing prompt, or it can be about something else. If you have stuff published, or you've done this process with documentary poetry, like Jen, or with your poetry, Michelle, I know you're an accomplished poet, Ingrid, others here. I mean, we have a lot of writers in the room, right? We're writers. So if there's something else you've done, you can think about those inspiration moments, those moments of inspiration, and think about those and how they gave you material. And you can ask yourself about a moment that overwhelms you, or an experience that has stuck with you because of its emotional gravity. Has any good come to you personally from this moment of loss? How might these benefits extend to the global scale? So I'm challenging you now to look for a global connection here. And how might your personal experience tie into a broader global context? And see this crisis, whatever this crisis you've written about, personal or planetary, whatever, how does it become that larger planetary level? Whether it's an individual experience of climate change that you then see linked through all these other instances across the planet, or the loss of a loved one. How does it link to a larger global picture? I know it's asking a lot, and I think it takes some thought and some time. So I want to give you guys 7 minutes on this. I'm going to stop talking and give you 7 minutes to write. And I'll be back with you in 7 minutes.
I'm going to cut you off about 30 seconds early because I have one more thing I want to do besides Q&A. So take 25 more seconds to wrap up that thought. Okay, so I want to just take a moment to wrap this up here. I want to show you, sorry, it's awkward operating this PowerPoint, making sure I'm clicking on the right part of it. Okay, yeah. So two important kinds of action and writing that we can think about when we look at the history of environmental literature and environmental activism. There are examples of resistance and renewal, and they often go hand in hand. I'm thinking of the Book of the Yak by Rich Bass, where he talks about the despoliation and logging of the Montana Yak River Valley, where he lived and where he fought day in, day out for the protection and preservation of that place, and those moments of personal regeneration or renewal, as well as resistance against the continued despoliation and logging of that place. But I want to read one example for you from Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She's a Potawatomi botanist who blends indigenous ways of knowing with Western science. She's really good at both, with personal experience, and makes the personal planetary. So here's an example of a very polished, expert author and an incredible human being doing this. This is from the beginning of a chapter called Defeating Wendigo. And for those who don't know, according to Kimmerer, the Wendigo is the legendary monster of our Anishinaabe people, the villain of a tale told on freezing nights in the North Woods. You can feel it lurking behind you, a being in the shape of an outsized man, 10 feet tall, with frost-white hair hanging from its shaking body. With arms like tree trunks, feet as big as snowshoes, it travels easily through the blizzards of the hungry time, stalking us. The hideous stench of its carrion breath poisons the clean scent of snow as it pants behind us. Yellow fangs hang from its mouth that is raw where it has chewed off its lips from hunger. Most telling of all, its heart is made of ice. So that's what Wendigo is. Here's a brief piece he mentions that. In the spring, I walk across the meadow toward my medicine woods where the plants give their gifts with unstinting generosity. It is mine not by deed, but by care. I've come here for decades to be with them, to listen, to learn, and to gather. The woods are a drift of white trillium where the snow was, but still I feel a chill. The light is somehow different. Across the ridge where unrecognizable footprints followed mine in last winter's blizzard. I should have known what those tracks meant, where they were. I now find the deep rutted prints of trucks headed across the field. The flowers are there, as they have been beyond memory, but the trees are gone. My neighbor brought the loggers over the winter.
There are so many ways to harvest honorably, but he chose otherwise, leaving only diseased beech and a few old hemlocks worthless to the mill. The trillium, bloodroot, hepatica, bellwort, trout, lily, ginger, and wild leeks are all smiling their last into the spring sun, which will burn them out when summer comes to a forest without trees. They trusted that the maples would be there, but the maples are gone, and they trusted me. Next year, this will all be brambles, garlic, mustard, and buckthorn, the invasive species that follow Wendigo footprints. I fear that a world made of gifts cannot coexist with a world made of commodities. I fear that I have no power to protect what I love against the Wendigo. So there's her moment of personal overwhelm in the face of all these logging and extractive practices. But here's her moment of inspiration, her flash of inspiration. Each of us comes from people who were once indigenous. We can reclaim our membership in the cultures of gratitude that formed our old relationships with the living earth. Gratitude is a powerful antidote to the Wendigo psychosis. A deep awareness of the gifts of the earth and of each other is medicine. The practice of gratitude lets us hear the badgering of marketers as the stomach grumblings of a Wendigo. It celebrates cultures of regenerative reciprocity where wealth is understood to be having enough to share and riches are counted in mutually beneficial relationships. Besides, it makes us happy. Gratitude for all the earth has given us lends us courage to turn and face the Wendigo that stalks us, to refuse to participate in an economy that destroys the beloved earth to line the pockets of the greedy, to demand an economy that is aligned with life, not stacked against it. It's easy to write that, harder to do. So yeah, there's a brief moment of that I think encapsulates this basic principle that I've laid out for you today, which is that idea of plumbing the depths of your own grief and your own existential overwhelm in order to come to these moments of flashes of inspiration, and to keep in mind that we need both resistance and renewal in this time, in this Anthropocene. We need moments where there's a picture of me both with my 3-year-old daughter, Fiona. In one, we were standing with some tree sitters in Nevada County who successfully stopped PG&E from cutting down every single last tree they wanted to cut down in the name of fire safety, according to many, including a very well-noted botanist whose advice they ignored. Most of the trees they needed to remove posed no significant threat. So this was really informed, really thoughtful activism that I participated in despite not having a whole lot of mobility as a parent. I was there, I showed up, and that's a baby step I took. I wrote lots. I wrote blog posts. I wrote social media posts to get people here. I'm working on a pamphlet to help people resist if PG&E comes for their trees and they're not needing to be removed. And then there I am on a hammock, right? Renewal, we need those moments too. So I just want to see thumbs up quickly. I know I'm almost out of time, but for how many of you do you feel more like you're equipped to plumb those depths and write about something personal and make it planetary? Lots of thumbs. Okay, good. And maybe like Bettina Love kept mentioning that she's maybe preaching to the choir. Maybe I'm preaching to the choir here a little bit, but I think we need to continue to give each other strength and sustenance, especially in this time. So I think this kind of community we have here is amazing, and I'm grateful to have been part of it. I think we have 2 minutes, if my clock is right, for questions. I will take questions now.
Go ahead and throw your questions in the chat for Chris. That was wonderful, Chris. We have all kinds of great comments going in the chat. Michelle says, thinking about how writing can help us to show up, love, nurture, and be explicit about our relations with the planet. We do not exist without planet, without snakes, whales, monkeys. Just because we don't readily see the connectivity doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We write as a way through to connection. Mm-hmm. And Lisa writes, ecosystem connectivity is what keeps us alive. Humanity may very well be a herd running blindly over a cliff of our own industrial design, but the planet and some form of life will continue. This gives me peace, as does microbe? I'm not sure. Sending us to our collective knees. Lovely. And lots of thank yous.
Thanks, you guys. Thank you.
Justine says, I appreciate your work protecting those Nevada City trees. What a PG&E travesty. Nicole says, thank you so much for creating an experience within your share. We can all take baby steps. This was just one. Blessings. Jen Vernon adds, a gift of pandemic is humans getting a little quieter, can better listen. Wonderful comments. I wonder, Chris, if you could just quickly, in our last minute or so, my question that I always have about these kinds of writing projects is, how do you, and I've read your writing, and so I know you do it so well, how do you go from big to small, you know, from that overwhelm and that sort of litany, as you mentioned, to getting to that small, that specificity that can be so powerful?
Well, I start with my own experience, and I think that's why examples like Rick Bass, I think I said Rich Bass because I'm nervous. Rick Bass's his essay on Willow Creek and his book, The Book of the Yak, are both inspirations, early inspirations in my career as an academic, as far as looking at your personal experience as a well to plumb for those flashes of inspiration that let you connect that individual lived experience to the planetary. And I think there's that old cliche, think globally, act locally, but I think it's really valuable. I think we also weirdly have the ability to almost act globally now through media channels, and through these other means. So I think that we are in a really unique time, and the odds are stacked against us, but I'd call it long odds but good company. And I'd say, to answer your question maybe a little bit more, is I think about this stuff a lot. I read a lot. Bettina Love mentioned earlier that reading is the best way to become a better writer. And I read a lot, and I've read a lot of environmental philosophy, not exactly literature. Like, I'm not as big into fiction or even nature writing as I am into the philosophy around this stuff, that has moved me and changed me. I mean, and some of it is nature writing. I mean, Braiding Sweetgrass, incredible book. Right now I'm reading The Call of the Forest by Diana Beresford Kroger, and it's an incredible book. It has moved me to look for my own bits of ancestral indigenous heritage, as much as I can have that as a person of Irish ancestry, and look to the ancient Irish before colonization and see that as maybe a mirror of so I look at my own story, and I try to make those larger connections. Ingrid, thanks. I think we're out of time, huh? Probably.
It's inching that way, but it'd be lovely to go on. There's so much to talk about here, and we all just so appreciate your presentation.
Thank you. I really appreciate being included. And I want to say to everyone, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it that people care about this. All the comments in the chat give me hope.
Absolutely.